Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues. Our theme today is about stories and about compelling movements that are poised to change the world. Of all the challenges that we have been discussing in this summit, to me there is no greater blight on our integrity as a global community than continuing to ignore the constant hunger and the desperate poverty experienced every day by over 1 billion of our fellow human beings. The immense scale of rural hunger is particularly unacceptable in today's world of ever-growing wealth and prosperity. It's a tragedy of immense proportions, particularly unacceptable because we are growing richer all the time. I want to tell you a story about how we can change all that and how it can be done in Africa by building upon the resourcefulness of African farmers who are engaged by the millions in creating a continent-wide evergreen agriculture. I want to demonstrate how you in the spatial data generation and utilization community can get involved in this movement and make a sterling contribution to solving the problem of ending hunger in the foreseeable future. My story will seek to do 3 things. First, I want to make the case that assisting small-scale farmers to succeed in regenerating the health of their land is the real key to ending the vast majority of hunger in the world. Second, I will show a pool of evidence that they can largely do this themselves at little or no cash cost and with minimal risk as long as they get some reasonable outside assistance. It is already happening on millions of hectares in a number of countries, and I want to show you how that story can be expanded on an enormously greater scale. And finally, I will propose that we launch at this summit a major new alliance of spatial data generators and data users to assemble the knowledge that we need to guide the massive upscaling of this evergreen agriculture movement that is now gaining ground by the day in countries throughout Africa and Asia. Hunger is a global tragedy, a failure of both the global will as well as national political will. That billion of hungry people was supposed to be cut in half by 2015 as a target of Millennium Development Goal number 1. But in reality, however, the number of hungry people has been increasing relentlessly during the past decade. Hunger is increasingly localized in 2 regions, South Asia and Africa. And I see that my circles have been transposed to the north, but they should be over those 2 continents. To overcome hunger and to provide for the increased population expected in the next 35 years, the developing world absolutely must double its food production again over the next few decades. Hunger in today's world is primarily a condition on the small-scale farm. That's because 4 out of 5 of the hungry poor in the world are actually rural farming communities and households. That's something you may not be aware of because people think of hunger as a city or an urban affair, but actually not. These rural people are not simply growing enough food to last them through the entire year. They experience a hunger period which generally occurs during the crop growing season when the family needs the most energy for their agricultural activities. In Zambia, for example, this is typical across Africa, there are times when, during the season, virtually 100% of the farm families are completely out of maize, their basic food. Now, over the years, we have noticed that cereal yields, fortunately, have been increasing in most regions in the tropics, but not in Africa. And since populations in Africa have been doubling and redoubling during these years, per capita food production has been steadily declining. Smallholder agriculture is now in deep crisis in Africa. Farm sizes are also declining rapidly, and a majority of farm households in many countries cannot now even produce enough food to last the entire year. That hunger period I mentioned is an annual event for hundreds of millions of rural people. And when the rains fail, there is famine, as evidenced by the devastating famine currently in progress in my neighborhood in Eastern Africa. Now, why is that? Well, most observers believe that the fundamental problem is that Africa's soils are degrading rapidly and their nutrient supplies are not being replenished. And indeed, if we look at fertilizer use in Africa, we find that commercial fertilizer use is minimal in the aggregate compared to the other regions of the world. And only 1 in 5 farmers in Africa are applying any fertilizer at all. This is both because fertilizers tend to cost twice or 3 times as much at the farm level as elsewhere in the world, but even more important, frequent droughts make the risks of buying and applying fertilizers just too steep to bear for poor farmers. So ending rural hunger for hundreds of millions of people will depend on regenerating the health of their land. But we need to think and act in different ways, out-of-the-box, unconventional ways, if we're going to address this conundrum in a way that will really address the realities that are on the ground. Unlike in the temperate areas, smallholder farmers in the tropics actually have always husbanded trees on their farms, along with their food crops, and they continue to cultivate them for a great variety of purposes. The World Agroforestry Center recently completed a global analysis of tree cover on agricultural lands that revealed that on over half of the agricultural land of the world, tree cover is actually greater than 10%. And in some regions, such as Southeast Asia and Central America, tree cover on farms exceeds 30% of the farmlands. Now, FAO has noted that 2 trends seem almost universal in the tropics. The number of trees in forests is declining, which is well known to all of us. But did you know that the number of trees on farms is increasing? The integration of trees in food crop fields is a process that we call evergreen agriculture, a form of more intensive farming where trees are grown in compatible ways with annual crops, and thus maintaining a green cover on the land throughout the year. Imagine for a moment a future where smallholder farmers and large farmers as well practice much of their food crop production under a canopy of trees, such as you see in this photo, taken of a maize production system in the breadbasket of Tanzania. Imagine that these trees are not competing with the food crops, but rather quite the opposite. They are dramatically enhancing the yield of these crops due to their striking effects on soil fertility. For they are nitrogen-fixing trees, leguminous trees, acting as fertilizer factories in the field, providing tons of nutrient-rich biomass year after year with virtually no investment cost. Now this is a kind of solution that poor farmers can afford. During the dry season, when the trees are actually in full leaf, they provide a rich source of fodder through their leaves and pods when virtually all other vegetation has dried off and died. But in the wet season, as you see here, the trees are dormant, without leaves, and therefore do not compete with the crops. Rather, as I mentioned, providing nitrogen fertilizer. Well, this system isn't an imaginary one. It's actually a system of agriculture already practiced today by millions of farmers in Africa. The tree is an African acacia, an indigenous species present all across the continent and cultivated by farmers throughout the Sahel to East Africa to Southern Africa as a fertilizer and fodder tree. I met these hardworking ladies a couple of years ago. They were out harvesting their maize in central Malawi, where they and 500,000 of their neighbors have these acacia trees in their maize fields. They told me that they were making barely 10 bags of maize per acre before they started culturing the trees. That's about a ton per hectare, very low average yield. But since they began growing these trees as an intercrop with their maize, their soils have improved to such an extent that they are now regularly harvesting about triple their former yields, year after year, in a sustainable manner. Well, indeed, trial data from dozens of scientific studies in countries all over Africa bear out what these ladies were telling us. Growing cereal crops in association with these amazing African acacias typically doubles or triples crop yields. These trial data were over 40 sites last 3 years in Zambia. And these systems build soil organic matter. They recreate soil health, and they make mineral fertilizer applications, if they are affordable, even more efficient. Well, here's a typical on-farm nursery that's generating the seedlings enough to plant a 1-hectare field. Currently, the national recommendations in Malawi and Zambia are to plant just 100 of these trees per hectare. The Conservation Farming Unit of Zambia, which is part of the National Farmers Union, has extended small-scale conservation farming practices with these acacia trees on 240,000 hectares in Zambia, on small farms as well as large commercial farms. In Malawi, the National Agroforestry Food Security Program has used a whole village mobilization approach to extend the full portfolio of fertilizer, fruit, fodder, fuel wood, and timber trees to farmers all over the country. The program has reached now 200,000 farm families in the past 5 years and is gearing up to reach all farms, that is 2.8 million farms across the country in the future. And indeed, recent surveys of actual farm yields as a result of Malawian farmers using these fertilizer trees shows that yields have practically tripled on their farms during that period of time. In Kenya, we now have a bold new policy to achieve greater than 10% tree cover on all farms in the country, which is now being achieved through a national evergreen agriculture scaling up program. In Ethiopia, this tree, this indigenous fertilizer tree, is commonly found in cereal crop systems throughout the country, but it could be extended on a much greater scale. But last week, in Durban, at the Climate Change Conference, Ethiopia announced a program to work with farmers to establish 100 million new fertilizer trees of this acacia on farmlands across the country. Earlier, in April, the Prime Minister announced that it will be reforesting, that Ethiopia will be reforesting 15 million hectares of degraded lands throughout the country through community-based assisted natural regeneration. Now let's turn to the West African Sahel. Niger is a country at the southern edge of the Sahara Desert. It is the poorest country in the world, eternally engaged in a battle with drought and desertification. The drought cycles of the 1970s and 80s were devastating. But farmers in Niger haven't been passive about battling drought. They've been actively engaged in re-engineering their agricultural landscapes and doing so on a huge scale. They've observed that trees in their crop fields may produce dramatically positive effects on the crops that grow underneath them, as you see here. And here we observe the impact of a single acacia tree on crop growth and biomass from a satellite image. The positive effects are really stunning. Now, this observation prompted, over the past 2 decades, millions of farm families in Niger to attack land degradation by regenerating medium to high densities of these highly useful trees on their farmlands. You can actually see that vision now on 5 million hectares of millet and sorghum farms in Niger, as in this picture, where there has been an explosion of tree culture over the past 15 years. These were virtually treeless landscapes 25 years ago. They are now totally transformed. They are not forests. They are agricultural fields with a dense cover of up to 150 trees per hectare. Now, the dark green in the photo is millet fields. The white blobs are the canopies of these acacia trees, bare and dormant in the wet season, with tree populations between 30 and 200 trees per hectare. Well, farmer-managed regreening in Niger alone has resulted in over 5 million hectares regreened in the past 20 years, with almost no investment costs from the outside and no recurrent costs to government. It has resulted in over 200 million new trees that has resulted in additional cereal crop yields of at least 500,000 tons per hectare, 500,000 tons nationally, and an additional 2.5 million people having been fed as a result. Here is a before and after comparison of tree cover trends in one part of this area, in Galma, showing how much tree cover has actually intensified since 1975. Quite dramatic. Well, we have been witnessing this transformation not only in Niger, but across the Sahel. For example, we're seeing a vast regeneration of new agroforests across the farmlands of the Seno Plains in southern Mali. This has been determined to be about 450,000 hectares regenerated during the past 15 years. The U.S. Geological Survey has recently mapped tree cover density on the Seno Plains. These maps and analyses have proven to be of huge significance, both in demonstrating the amazing scale of the spread at national and regional levels, which was until very recently entirely unappreciated, but also in targeting the next round of scaling up. In fact, the expansion of agroforestry parklands in West Africa is a very solid basis for a new vision of regreening the Sahel. And the Global Environment Facility and the World Bank have both now pledged to specifically focus their co-investments in the region toward the spread of these sustainable land management and natural resource management solutions in the Sahel in support of participatory, grassroots assisted natural regeneration. And one key aspect of this is emphasis on greater efforts on land surveillance for targeting new efforts across the region. Now, we must link those that are doing the mapping and monitoring with those who are piloting and upscaling these efforts. A couple of months ago, the African Ministers of Agriculture convened in Johannesburg, South Africa. They were given a briefing bulletin on the opportunities for creating a climate-smart agriculture in each of their countries. It was prepared by the African Union, the World Bank, FAO, and a number of other organizations. In it, the great potentials for land regeneration on small-scale farms were highlighted as the basis of climate-smart agriculture. Why? Because they involve very low investment costs, as they are truly participatory efforts that spread through the engagement of farmers and their communities. In fact, there's probably no more low-cost, low-risk method of land regeneration. Currently, a massive effort is emerging among governments, research institutions, and international and national development partners to expand evergreen agriculture across tens of millions more hectares in Africa and Asia. 20 countries are now implementing national evergreen agriculture scaling up programs, preparing to launch them, or seriously studying the prospects. And currently, we are working to ensure that the next phase of effort will be to accelerate this work, continue the development of these programs, and spearhead ongoing studies that will lead to additional countries being involved in this effort. Well, in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with 5 take-home messages. First, a fresh, low-cost approach to land regeneration and food security has taken root in Africa and is spreading across the tropics. Second, millions of smallholders are adopting effective land regeneration methods, and double-story evergreen agricultural systems are increasingly seen as the basis for a reinvention of agriculture in the 21st century. Third, poor households should be the target over large areas to end hunger, particularly in the drylands. Fourth, many nations are creating policy and institutional environments to favor this adoption. And finally, the remote sensing and spatial analysis communities are critical for attracting investment support for the upscaling of this unconventional approach. We now need to launch a continent-wide effort to underpin this transformation that will expand the collection and the analysis of geographic data to better target these scaling up efforts and to monitor the progress of land regeneration through land health surveillance systems. I believe that such an alliance of the data producers and the data users could dramatically accelerate the sustainable achievement of food security in Africa and Asia, and could do so at a pace that could truly end rural hunger in the foreseeable future. That's where you come into the picture. We need to discuss together how such an alliance can be launched and how it can best contribute to the overall effort of achieving food security in Africa, and soon. Thank you very much.